The wind roared like a wounded beast as Nancy Moore pressed her hands against the trembling window pane. Outside, the trees bent under the fury of the rain, and lightning flashed across the black sky like veins of fire. The power flickered once, twice, then vanished completely. The house plunged into silence and darkness, and Nancy's heart began to race. She lit a candle with shaking fingers, its small flame barely enough to chase the shadows away. The air smelled of damp wood and fear. Every creak of the old house sounded like a whisper from the past. She thought of Mark, her husband gone 3 winters ago, and how quiet the house had become since. Now, the silence felt heavier than ever. Nancy sat by the window, watching the storm rage on, unable to see even the outline of her neighbor's porch light. Willow Creek was swallowed by night. For the first time in years, she felt utterly alone. The storm outside echoed the one that had been raging inside her heart for far too long. When thunder shook the walls, she flinched, clutching her robe tighter around her. The candle trembled but did not go out. That tiny, stubborn flame seemed to fight the darkness just as she did. Small, tired, but unwilling to surrender. It gave her a strange comfort. Hours passed with no sound but the rain. She checked her phone dead battery. The clock on the wall had stopped. Time itself felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. Nancy stared into the dim light and wondered when the morning would come. She remembered her children, now scattered across states, their lives too full to call often. She didn't blame them. They had their own storms. But tonight, the distance between them felt infinite. For the first time, she whispered aloud, "I wish you were here." As she blew out the candle to save the wick, the darkness wrapped around her completely. Somewhere deep in her chest, a thought flickered like the last spark before the match goes out. Maybe the light would have to come from her this time. When dawn finally broke, the world was pale and gray, as if even the sun was too tired to rise. Nancy opened her door to a chilling stillness. The street was littered with fallen branches, wet leaves, and the faint smell of ozone. Not a single hum of electricity. Not a single car passing by. Willow Creek had gone quiet. She wrapped a scarf around her shoulders and stepped outside, boots sinking into the soaked ground. Across the road, Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch, holding a lantern. Her eyes met Nancy's, and both women exchanged a look that needed no words. "We're on our own now." A stray dog barked in the distance, then silence again. Nancy made her way down the block, checking on neighbors as she went. Most houses were dark, windows fogged, people peeking out nervously. Without the buzz of modern life, every sound felt amplified. The crunch of gravel, the murmur of voices, the whisper of wind through empty mailboxes. At the corner, she found an elderly man sitting on his steps, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Power's still out," he muttered. "Generator's dead." Nancy knelt beside him, wrapping her coat around his shoulders. "We'll figure something out," she said. Though she didn't know how. She continued walking, heart pounding faster with each house she passed. She saw children staring from windows, faces pale and confused. She thought of how fear grows in silence, how quickly hope can fade when there's no light to hold on to. It stirred something inside her, something fierce and familiar. When she returned home, she stood in her kitchen, looking around at the dark outlines of her furniture. The house that once felt like safety now seemed like a shell. She wanted to hide, to wait it out, but her hands itched to do something. Anything. Nancy opened the door once more, stepping into the cold air. The storm had taken their light, but maybe she could give it back, one small spark at a time. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve began to glow. Nancy rummaged through the basement, coughing as dust filled the air. Boxes from years gone by surrounded her holiday decorations, old clothes, memories packed away. And then, at the back of a shelf, she found a box marked "Winter Candles." Her heart lifted. She hadn't seen them since her first Christmas alone. She carried the box upstairs and began lighting each candle, one by one. The flames danced in the dimness, flickering across framed photos on the walls. Mark's smile, her children's faces all illuminated in golden warmth. For the first time since the storm began, she felt less afraid. Nancy gathered a few candles, wrapped them carefully, and set out into the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the streets still damp. One by one, she knocked on doors offering candles, matches, and a kind word. At first, people looked surprised. Then they smiled, grateful, as tiny lights began to glow inside each home. Soon, the street wasn't so dark anymore. From house to house, soft amber windows bloomed like fireflies waking from sleep. Nancy paused. At the end of the block, watching it all, how one small act could ripple outward, chasing away the shadows. She hadn't felt this alive in years. As she walked back toward her porch, she noticed laughter drifting through the air. Children giggling, adults talking softly, the faint sound of a guitar from somewhere down the street. The silence had broken. Willow Creek was breathing again. Standing there, candlelight brushing her face, Nancy smiled. She hadn't meant to lead anyone, but perhaps leadership was just doing what you could when no one else did. And in that glow, she felt something bloom inside her chest. The first spark of belonging. When she stepped inside and closed the door, the reflection of dozens of tiny lights shimmered on her window pane. The darkness was still there, but it no longer felt endless. The next morning, Nancy woke to the smell of coal ashes in the fireplace. Her kitchen was still powerless, but her spirit wasn't. She gathered wood, lit a small fire, and placed a pot of water above it. The steam rose slowly, curling into the air like a promise. She smiled. Coffee, something simple. Something warm was exactly what they all needed. She walked outside with a tray of steaming cups, calling softly to her neighbors. Soon, a handful of them gathered on her porch, wrapped in blankets, eyes sleepy but curious. She poured each cup carefully, the smell of coffee mixing with the crisp scent of morning. Someone laughed, another sighed, and the sound filled the emptiness between them. They began to talk about the storm, about how long the power might be out, about old stories from when Willow Creek was young. The porch filled with voices, warmth, and life. Nancy listened, sometimes laughing, sometimes quiet, feeling the invisible threads weaving them together. As the hours passed, more people came. A woman brought muffins, a teenager carried logs for the fire, a man offered his old radio that still worked on batteries. What began as coffee became community. The fear that had gripped them was melting like frost under sunlight. Nancy sat back, watching the scene unfold. She realized she hadn't hosted anyone since Mark's funeral. For years, she'd told herself she preferred solitude, but maybe what she'd really been doing was hiding from others, from pain, from herself. When the fire burned low, someone asked, "What will we do tonight if the power's still out?" Nancy looked around, at their faces glowing with gratitude and light. "We'll find a way," she said softly. "We always do." And in that moment, she believed it. By the third day, Nancy's porch had turned into the heart of Willow Creek. People came and went, bringing stories, candles, food, and news. Without the hum of technology, they were forced to talk hand. They rediscovered how much they had to say. It was as if the blackout had unplugged their loneliness. Nancy began organizing small groups, one for gathering wood, one for cooking, one for checking on the elderly. She wrote names on scraps of paper and pinned them to her door. The street buzzed with quiet purpose. For the first time, the town felt like a living organism. Each person, a heartbeat. An old man who'd barely spoken in years began telling stories about Willow Creek's founding days. Children played in the street without phones, chasing shadows and laughter. Even the most reserved neighbors found reasons to smile. The darkness had not beaten them, had revealed their light. Late that afternoon, a few people stopped by to thank Nancy. She shook her head humbly, saying she'd only done what anyone would do. But as they left, she felt tears prick her eyes, because deep down, she knew not everyone would have done it, and she was proud that she did. When night fell, she stood on her porch, lantern in hand, and looked out at the soft glow scattered across the town. Every window held a flicker of hope. It was more beautiful than any electric light had ever been. Nancy whispered into the night, "Maybe this is what we were missing." The wind rustled through the trees, as if answering her. She didn't know it yet, but Willow Creek's story was just beginning. The evening air carried a strange tension, like the calm before another storm. Children played near the old oak tree, while parents gathered at Nancy's porch, trading stories by lantern light. Suddenly, a voice pierced the chatter, a mother calling her daughter's name. The laughter stopped instantly. Fear rippled through the crowd like a shiver. Nancy's heart tightened. She grabbed her flashlight and asked what had happened. The little girl, Lily, had wandered off during a game of hide-and-seek. The woods near the creek were dark and tangled, dangerous at night. Nancy didn't hesitate. She handed her lantern to a neighbor and stepped into the shadows. Dozens of footsteps followed her. The beam of her flashlight danced through the trees as people called Lily's name into the cold wind. Each echo returned empty. Nancy's voice grew hoarse, but she refused to stop. The sound of rushing water told her they were close to the creek. Somewhere, a small sob answered back. she found Lily crouched by the water's edge, trembling, clutching a broken doll. Nancy knelt and wrapped the child in her coat, whispering that everything was all right. The girl's tears soaked her shoulder, and for a moment Nancy felt the warmth of a love she thought she had lost forever. Together, they began the slow walk home. When they emerged from the trees, cheers erupted. The entire street seemed to breathe again. The mother ran forward, collapsing into tears as she hugged her daughter. Nancy stood aside, watching the reunion, her face lit by dozens of lanterns. For the first time in years, she felt truly needed. The light had found its way back. That night, after everyone had gone home, Nancy sat in the quiet of her living room. The adrenaline from the search faded, leaving her surrounded by stillness once again. She stared at the flickering shadows on the walls and felt the old ache returning. But beneath it, there was something new, a small, steady pulse of courage. She went to the attic, driven by a feeling she couldn't explain. Boxers lined the walls, filled with fragments of her old life. She opened one and found a photograph of her family, taken at the creek years ago. Mark's arm around her shoulders, her children laughing, the same tree standing tall behind them. A lump rose in her throat. Nancy traced her fingers over Mark's smile. The grief that had once drowned her now felt different, less like a storm, more like rain nourishing the soil. She realized that remembering him didn't have to hurt, it could guide her. For the first time, she spoke his name aloud and didn't cry. She smiled instead. She spent hours sorting through memories, letters, birthday cards, tiny keepsakes. Each one told her that love doesn't disappear, it transforms. Maybe the reason she'd felt so empty was because she'd stopped sharing that love with the world. Now, she wanted to give it back. When she finally came downstairs, the first light of dawn slipped through the window. The world outside was still dark, but a new day was coming. Nancy whispered to the empty room, "I'm still here, Mark, and I think I know what I'm meant to do." The silence that followed felt peaceful, almost like an answer. By the end of the week, Willow Creek was still without power, but no one complained anymore. The town had changed. Nancy decided it was time to bring everyone together, really together. She walked to the center of town, cleared the leaves, and built a circle of stones. "A fire," she said softly. "We need a fire." As dusk fell, she lit the first flame. One by one, people gathered, families, neighbors, even those she barely knew. Someone brought food, another brought a guitar. Soon, the air filled with laughter, music, and the scent of roasted apples. The fire crackled, throwing golden sparks into the night sky like tiny pieces of hope. Nancy sat among them, watching faces glow in the firelight. She saw people who hadn't spoken in years share stories, strangers become friends, and children fall asleep in their parents' arms. For the first time, Willow Creek felt whole. The darkness no longer frightened anyone, it brought them closer. Someone began to sing an old folk song, and others joined in. Their voices rose together, blending with the whisper of the wind. Nancy felt tears well in her eyes, not from sadness, but gratitude. She realized she hadn't just found a community, she'd helped rebuild one. When the fire burned low, everyone promised to meet again the next night. Nancy lingered as the last embers glowed. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for the darkness. Without it, we would never have seen this light." The night answered with gentle silence. After the fire, the nights grew quieter again. Though the town had found its rhythm, Nancy felt an unease she couldn't name. Sitting on her porch, she watched lanterns flicker in the distance and wondered what would happen when the power returned. Would everyone drift apart again? Would the silence return? She tried to ignore the thoughts, but they lingered like smoke after a flame. The porch that had been full of laughter now echoed with emptiness once more. Nancy poured herself tea, hands trembling slightly, and realized she was afraid not of the dark, but of being forgotten when the light came back. One morning, she went to the creek alone. The air was cool, the water calm, but inside she felt restless. She knelt by the shore, staring at her reflection, seeing both the woman she was and the one she was becoming. "What happens now?" she whispered, and the ripples carried the question away. Memories of her husband's final words echoed in her mind. "Keep your light, Nancy. Don't let it fade." She had thought he meant surviving grief, but now she understood he meant more. She needed to keep shining, not just for others, but for herself. That night, as the wind rose again, she sat by her window and wrote in her journal, "The light is not gone, it's changing." She closed the book, feeling calmer. Even storms must end, and when they do, the world is washed clean. The morning began with a strange hum, soft at first, then louder, like the awakening of something long asleep. Nancy stepped outside just as the streetlights flickered back to life. One by one, the houses of Willow Creek lit up, their windows glowing like suns reborn. Cheers echoed down the street. The power had returned. Neighbors clapped, hugged, and shouted with joy. Children ran through puddles, laughing as televisions blinked to life inside homes. But Nancy stood still on her porch, watching the sudden brightness spread. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt different now. Artificial, distant. The glow that had once meant comfort now seemed hollow. She walked down the street, looking at each house. Doors were already closing, people retreating inside, voices fading. The town that had come alive in darkness was vanishing into light. Her heart ached. She had feared this moment, and now it was here. The silence she'd escaped was returning, dressed in electricity. When she reached the center of town, the fire pit still stood cold and empty. She touched the stones, still blackened by soot, and smiled sadly. "You gave us something real," she whispered. "Something the light can't replace." She straightened, a new thought forming in her mind. Nancy turned toward home, determination burning quietly in her chest. If the town could come alive once, it could happen again, this time by choice. The real light of Willow Creek had never come from the wires above their heads. It had come from the people, from their hearts, from her. In the days that followed, Willow Creek returned to its usual rhythm. The hum of refrigerators, the glow of televisions, and the chatter of radios filled the air once more. Yet beneath the noise, a strange emptiness lingered. The laughter that once echoed through the streets had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of isolation. That Nancy sat on her porch, sipping coffee, watching as neighbors passed without stopping. The fire pit in the town square was now forgotten, covered in fallen leaves. She missed the shared meals, the stories, the warmth of connection. Everything felt colder, even under the brightness of restored power. She wondered if the light had blinded them. Maybe people needed the dark to remember each other. The thought lingered like a haunting truth she didn't want to accept. She had seen their kindness, their strength, their unity. How could it vanish so quickly? The silence pressed against her chest like a weight. One morning, Nancy walked through town, visiting familiar faces. She found Mr. Carter fixing his porch light, Mrs. Henderson sweeping her steps, children inside glued to screens. Everyone smiled politely but seemed distant. The fire that had burned between them was dying, and no one noticed but her. That evening, she returned home and stood by the window, gazing at the glow of streetlights. The light outside was constant, but the one inside her felt dimmer. She whispered, "We can't lose this again." The idea that had been forming inside her heart began to take shape. Nancy took out her notebook and began to write. Plans, sketches, and words filled the pages. Community center, shared space, light from within. Her pen moved quickly, as though guided by something greater. It was time to bring Willow Creek together again. By the time the clock struck midnight, Nancy closed her notebook with trembling hands. The room was silent, but her purpose was clear. The light had returned, but now, she would make sure it stayed. The next morning, Nancy stood in her garage, staring at the dusty boxes stacked against the walls. "This will do," she said softly. The space was small, but it was enough. She cleared old tools, swept the floor, and opened the windows to let in the crisp autumn air. Her heart beat fast with nervous excitement. She painted the walls a pale yellow, the color of morning light. Neighbors passing by stopped to ask what she was doing. "Starting something new," she replied with a smile. Some looked curious, others skeptical, but a few offered to help. By afternoon, 2 women arrived with brushes and laughter, and the work truly began. They called it the Light Center. It wasn't fancy, just a place for people to gather, talk, and share. Someone donated chairs, another brought a table, and children painted signs that said, "Hope lives here." Nancy watched as the room filled with color and joy. It felt like breathing again after years underwater. Soon, the project spread through town. People who hadn't spoken in months worked side by side, fixing, cleaning, painting. Music played on a small radio, and voices rose in harmony with it. The same unity that once grew from darkness was blossoming again, this time in full light. When the grand opening came, Nancy stood at the door, heart pounding. The room buzzed with live children laughing, coffee brewing, stories shared in every corner. The mayor stopped by, shook her hand, and said, "You've brought Willow Creek back to life." Nancy smiled. "No," she said softly, "we all did." That night, when the lights went out for closing, no one rushed to leave. People lingered, talking quietly, as if afraid to break the magic. Nancy looked around and felt tears rise. The center wasn't just a building, it was a mirror of what they'd become. As she locked the door and stepped into the cool night, she looked up at the stars and whispered, "Mark, we did it." The breeze brushed her face, gentle as a reply. Word of the light center spread quickly, carried by photos, stories, and the quiet wonder of transformation. One afternoon, as Nancy arranged flowers by the window, she heard the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. Her heart skipped. Two familiar voices called her name, voices she hadn't heard together in years. Her son Michael and daughter Sarah stepped out, smiling uncertainly. "Mom," Sarah said, eyes glistening, "we saw everything online. We had to come." Nancy froze for a moment before rushing forward, pulling them both into her arms. The scent of home, the warmth of family, it all came rushing back like a tide. They spent the day walking through town, visiting the light center. The siblings met the people who now called Nancy their hero, though she insisted she was only a neighbor with spare paint and time. Michael laughed, shaking his head. "You never could sit still, Mom. You always had to fix things." She smiled. "Maybe I finally fixed myself." That evening, they shared dinner in the same kitchen that had once been silent. Candlelight flickered on their faces as they told stories of childhood, of Mark, of everything they had left unsaid. The laughter was soft but real, echoing through the walls like music. Before bed, Sarah hugged her tightly. "Dad would be proud," she whispered. Nancy's breath caught. She wanted to say so much, but only managed a nod. Love, she realized, didn't need many words. It glowed quietly, just like her candles. Later that night, Nancy walked outside. Her children slept inside, and the world felt whole again. She gazed at the houses lit across Willow Creek and thought how far she'd come. The darkness had given her everything she'd been missing, and as the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke, she knew her husband was near. The light she carried had reached even him. A year passed, and autumn returned with golden leaves and cool air. Willow Creek now held its first day of light, a festival born from Nancy's story. The streets shimmered with lanterns, each one handmade by someone in town. Children ran through, crowds, their laughter mingling with music and the hum of joy. Nancy walked among them, humbled and amazed. Every window, every porch, every heart glowed. The mayor gave a small speech in the town square, thanking her for reminding everyone of what truly matters. She blushed as applause surrounded her, tears glimmering under the lantern light. When night fell, they gathered by the fire pit once again. The same place that had once been dark and cold now blazed with warmth. People shared memories of the blackout, of how they found each other in the silence. Nancy listened quietly, hands folded in her lap, overwhelmed by the beauty of it all. A group of children performed a small play about the storm, ending with the words, "Even when the lights go out, love keeps shining." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Nancy wiped her eyes. She thought of Mark, of her lost years, and of how pain had become purpose. Everything had led her here. As the festival ended, hundreds of lanterns were released into the sky. They floated upward like stars being born. Nancy stood with her children, watching until they disappeared. "We did it," she whispered. "We kept the light alive." Music faded, laughter softened, but her heart burned brighter than ever. The world felt still, sacred, complete. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The darkness no longer frightened her, had become her teacher. The next morning, Willow Creek was quiet again. The festival lanterns had drifted away, leaving the town bathed in soft golden light. Nancy sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. She felt both peaceful and full, like a chapter had closed exactly where it should. She thought about everything the past year had brought: loss, courage, community, and love reborn. The storm that once terrified her now felt like a gift. Without it, she might never have found herself again. Every face she'd met, every laugh she'd shared, had become part of her story. Nancy walked to the edge of her yard, where the first candle she'd ever lit still sat in a jar. The wax was almost gone, but the glass was warm from the sun. She smiled softly, touching it. "You did your job," she whispered. "You showed me the way." The candle no longer needed to burn. The light had moved inside her. She looked out at Willow Creek quiet streets, golden trees, birds circling above. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. She knew that even when the next storm came, the town would stand together. They had learned that true light can't be lost, it simply changes form. Inside, her phone buzzed with messages, invitations, thank yous, plans for next year's festival. Life continued, vibrant and open. Nancy sat back in her chair, breathing deeply, letting the world be exactly as it was. She didn't need more. She had enough. The sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of honey. She whispered to the wind, "Thank you for the darkness, and for the light." The breeze brushed her cheek like a kiss. For the first time in a long, long while, Nancy Moore simply smiled and let the world glow.